The great industrial powers are locked in mortal combat. Millions are dying in the trenches in Europe, but the consequences of the war are felt around the globe. The old, semi-feudal Ottoman Turkish Empire, already shaken by nationalist revolution in 1908, is falling to pieces. And disastrously, it's allied to Germany. The British and French are out to make the most of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, and the British are out to protect the roots to the jewel in the crown, the British Empire in India. The British will promise anything to anyone if they think it will help them win the war. In 1915, Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Cairo, wants to encourage an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. He writes to Sharif Hussein, "As for the regions lying within the proposed frontiers, in which Great Britain is free to act without detriment to her ally France, I am authorised to give you the following pledges on behalf of the Government of Great Britain, and to reply to your note as follows. Great Britain is prepared to recognise and uphold the independence of the Arabs in all the regions lying within the frontiers proposed by the Sharif of Mecca." A year later, T. E. Lawrence of Arabia, writes an intelligence note to his British commanders and encouraged them to take the same course. He says it will be beneficial to us because it marches with our immediate aims: the breakup of the Islamic bloc, the defeat and disruption of the Ottoman Empire, and because the states that Sharif Hussein would set up to succeed the Turks would be harmless to ourselves. The Arabs are even less stable than the Turks, and if properly handled, they would remain in a state of political mosaic, a tissue of small, jealous principalities incapable of cohesion. Yet a year after this, Lord Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, made an incompatible promise to a small group within the international Jewish community, the Zionists. His declaration of November 1917 read as follows: His Majesty's Government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And he said that this should be with the understanding that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Two British promises about the same piece of land, self-determination for the Arabs and a homeland for the Jews. Both promises could not be kept, and it was the Balfour Declaration that was written into the treaties that ended the First World War. But treaties are just pieces of paper. Facts on the ground are a different thing. The British occupied Palestine in 1917, and after 1920 still ran Palestine under a mandate from the League of Nations. Neither the indigenous Arabs or Jews, who had lived in Palestine side by side for centuries, were granted any political rights. But the mandate did insist that the British must safeguard the interests of the Jewish settlers by placing the country under such political, administrative and economic conditions as will secure the establishment of a Jewish national home. Under British rule, Zionist immigration into Palestine rose to unprecedented levels. In 1930, just 4,000 Jewish settlers arrived, but by 1933 that figure had climbed to 30,000 Jewish settlers, and in the peak year of 1935, 60,000 Zionist settlers arrived in Palestine. Palestinian land was being brought up by settlers, often from absentee landlords. Society in Palestine was being thrown into the air in a way that had never happened in generations of Ottoman rule. Palestinians resisted. In 1921, in 1922, in 1929, and most of all, after the general strike of 1936, the British were unable to control the revolt. And neither could the British control the Zionists. Led by future Israeli leaders David Ben-Gurion, Yitzhak Shamir and Menachem Begin, they organised into militia and terrorist gangs like the Haganah, the Irgun and the Stern Gang. The Zionists aimed to drive the British out and to take control of Palestine. The First World War gave the Zionist project its start, and the Second World War gave the project its chance of victory. Britain was among the victors of the Second World War, but in 1945, Britain was an exhausted country, no longer able to shoulder the demands of empire. The Labour Party was elected by a landslide in the 1945 election, and it reflected the massive popular reaction against war and empire. Britain began the long retreat from empire, and India, Burma and Palestine were the first to see the British depart. Palestine was in any case ungovernable for the British by this time, a fact forcefully brought home to the Mandate government when the Zionist Irgun blew up its headquarters at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in July 1946. Less than 2 years later, the British were out and the newly formed United Nations were left in charge of Palestine. The UN enforced the partition of Palestine. Under its plan, the Zionists, who up until this point had purchased only 6% of Palestinian land, were granted control of 55% of Palestine. Towns and villages, factories and farms that had been Palestinian for time out of mind were handed over to the settlers. But the Zionists seized the moment and extended their gains even further by a campaign of terror against the Palestinian population. Armed militia and terror gangs swept through the Palestinian towns and villages, shooting and bombing as they went. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were driven from their homes. As the British left, the Zionists declared their own state, the State of Israel. The Palestinians and their Arab neighbours rejected this unilateral breach of the United Nations plan. A short war ensued, but the disunited Arabs and virtually unarmed Palestinians were now no match for the highly militarised settlers. By the end of the conflict in 1949, Israel had taken more land, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were exiled to the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip, Jordanian-controlled East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and to Jordan itself, Syria, Egypt and Lebanon. How could this ruthless expropriation of an entire people happen? What made it possible? Two things made the founding of the State of Israel possible. One was the support enjoyed by the Zionists from the major powers. First Britain, then the League of Nations acting through Britain, then the United Nations, and latterly the United States. Without this, the tiny band of Zionists, still a minority current within their own community, could not possibly have established a foothold in Palestine. The second was the impact of the Holocaust. The industrial extermination of European Jewry by Hitler and the Nazis was only becoming fully known at the time that the Zionists were expropriating the Palestinians. The overwhelming horror of the Holocaust made many more Jews sympathetic to the Zionists, though still most wanted to go to America or Europe rather than to Israel. But the suffering of the Jews also made non-Jews sympathetic to the Zionists, and they did not always stop to reflect on whether the Zionists actually represented what most Jews thought. Yet the truth is that the establishment of the State of Israel deepened the tragedy of the Jewish people. It has allowed the horror of the Holocaust to be used by the Zionists as an excuse for the dispossession of the Palestinians. Thus one tragedy is used to justify a second, one great crime used to hide another.